Welcome back to Coolio Loves Comic Books. For this episode, I want to give you my first impressions of this book, Dune House Atreides, published by Boom Studios. I'm a big fan of Dune. This is my paperback copy here. I've read this book a few times, at least 2 or 3 times, and it is one of my favorite novels of all time. Now, before we get to this book, if you haven't read the novel, if you're familiar with it, Dune has been on my mind for a few reasons lately. First and foremost, of course, if you're watching this, probably you're aware too that there is a new adaptation of this novel coming out by Denis Villeneuve. And he is actually taking this first novel and turning it into a trilogy, which I think is absolutely brilliant, and there's definitely enough character depth and story depth here to do that in spades, really. But it's also been on my mind because I made that video on The Long Tomorrow, the story by Moebius, and kind of that tied into his involvement, or in researching that, it tied into his involvement in storyboarding Jodorowsky's Dune. So that was the film adaptation that Jodorowsky was trying to make back in 1974. And he originally intended to make a movie that I think was 6 hours long. And then David Lynch, of course, made his version of Dune in 1984. That's the one that I was familiar with, like basically initially, like my first contact. I remember being a kid and watching, I think there's a 3.5 hour version that they played on TV, and I definitely remember watching that a few times. If I remember right, it was actually they split it over 2 nights, so part 1 and part 2. And then when I got later into high school or beginning of college, I can't remember exactly when, but that's when I first read the novel, and was just, I liked the movie, but then when I read the novel, I was just totally taken with the story. So there's a lot here. There's some history here. People have made this movie before, and I think, like, right at the front, I will say what's really interesting about this is Jodorowsky says something in that documentary about his attempt to make this into a movie, because he was trying to make this movie in '74, 3 years before Star Wars came out. And he said that if he could have made the movie that he wanted to make, or that he envisioned, he was trying to basically change the world with this movie. And he was saying that, the way that we think of Star Wars, we would think of Dune that way instead of Star Wars, because it would have come out first. And I'm not saying that he could have done it back then, but the possibility is there. There's so much in this world of Dune, created by Frank Herbert, that it is I think not unfair, or I don't think it's incorrect to compare it to kind of like something like the world of Star Wars. So, being a fan of Star Wars, being a fan of Dune, and knowing kind of how the world of Dune hasn't taken off as much as it could have, I'm really excited by the prospect of this new movie, especially because they're doing the first novel as a trilogy. I think that's an absolutely brilliant move. So, as you can imagine, as soon as I saw this book, Dune House Atreides, I immediately picked it up. I didn't have to research it. You didn't have to tell me anything. I was like, all right, I'm at least going to pick up the first couple issues and check it out. Now, what struck me the most about this is, from the title being House Atreides, I kind of assumed that it was going to be picking up maybe where the first novel left off, and going forward from there. And that is not it at all. In fact, it's the complete opposite direction. This book is a whole generation before. This is, I'd say, 20 or 30 years before the story that goes on in the Frank Herbert novel Dune. And that's really interesting to me. So, for instance, Leto Atreides, Duke Leto Atreides, is 12 years old. So I guess he's Prince Leto in this comic. And it's just a first issue, so I can only give you first impressions. There's just, it's basically setting up story arcs, and that's all that it is. But we see a lot. We see a lot of worlds. There's a lot of talk of the worlds, and that's got me excited. We see Caladan, and we see a lot more depth of Caladan than we see, especially in the movie, and I would almost argue even than we see even in the books. There's some different aspects of that, and we're going to meet Leto as a 12-year-old, and maybe go on from there. That's interesting. We see Arrakis in Dune, and we see it, and it feels very much like you would expect. But it's also really interesting because we see K-10. I think it's K10. That's the home of the Imperium, where the Emperor lives. That planet, and that's interesting. And the Emperor in this story is Elrond the Ninth. So it's not Shaddam the Fourth. It's Elrond, and so we are coming in, and we're going to meet a lot of the characters, decades before the story of Dune, and it's very clear also that we're going to be exploring the worlds that this story of Dune is set in, and that's really exciting to me. There's mention of Ix, the computer planet. There's just mention of it. There's mention of it in the book. There's mention of it in the movies, but we might get to see it, and I'm really curious what how it looks, what the art looks like. Just that's one of the really interesting aspects of Dune that has just so much potential, is the different planets, the different peoples, the different cultures are so wildly different and unique that it's just you really want to kind of see them and explore them and get a sense of all of them, and then see how they kind of roll and tie into the overall story. And that's a huge plus to base a science fiction story on, when you've got that much of a foundation you can build from. And it seems like we're going to see that in this book. And what I almost get a feel for, or my guess might be that even if this is only like 6, 10, 12 issues, if this can kind of come out and be kind of wrapped up by the time that the movie comes out, if you read this book, you're getting introduced to a lot of the characters that you're going to meet in the story of Dune. Again, ostensibly, at least to start, decades before. But you're going to meet them, you're going to know them, you're going to have a sense of the world. And that's one of the hardest things with this story. Like, if you're coming in with no experience, it is so deep and complicated. It's like Game of Thrones or Tolkien, for that matter. There's just so much depth there. There's an appendix at the back of this book that is pretty thick, with who's who and what are these terms and all that sort of thing. So I think if it's really interesting to explore the worlds that Dune is set in, and it's really cool to get a lot of the backstory of these characters. Where maybe it's a character that is on screen or in the proper book of Dune for like a few minutes or a few pages, but there's a whole bunch of backstory now. You're going to get a lot more sense for who that person is, who that character is, and how it ties into this story, which is just brilliant. Because again, it's so complicated, and that's one of the knocks against the novel, is it's so complicated that it really knocks people off the book before you really get through enough to really get into the story and comfortable enough with who the characters are. So I think I'm really curious to see where they go. I'm curious to see the worlds, and I'm curious to see if do they stay 30 years before, or does it kind of move forward in time, and does it really tie into the initial story of Dune? We'll just have to see. I will say, as just a quick footnote, if you've tried to read Dune, the novel, or you want to read Dune, and it's just you can't make sense of who's who, I'll give you a piece of advice, which is for the David Lynch Dune from 1984. I believe it was in the theatrical version, but you should be able to find it online. There's a 10-minute animated introduction to the movie that basically walks you through the world and who the planets are and who some of the characters are. And if you even just watch that and then you dive into the book, you're going to have a lot better sense of kind of enough of the foundation that it's going to make more sense to you. Or for that matter, heck, just go and watch, David Lynch's Dune. It's an abridged version of the story, and there's some pretty significant changes to the story, but you'll get enough of a sense of the characters and what's going on that then when you read the story, it'll make a lot more sense. So if you're wanting to read the book and it just hasn't quite worked out for you, I would definitely give you that piece of advice too. So, but heck, from reading it so far, I think picking this book up and kind of sticking with it might give you a really good sense of the worlds and what's going on. So I'm really excited about this, and I'm hopeful that it's going to be a good story. We'll just have to see. So maybe we'll check in once this thing is all done, and we'll go from there. So hopefully you'll like the comic. Hopefully you'll like the novel. Give this a try if you're interested. It's one of my favorite novels of all time. And until next time, Take care, and we'll catch you on the next one.